और फ्यूचर इकोनॉमी जो है हमारी, उसको अब पनपने में अगर आज 1 साल या 2 साल का अरसा लगता तो ये अरसा बहुत ज़्यादा लगेगा। तो मैं आपसे ये कहना चाहता हूँ कि ये नया जो फैक्टर आया है इसको आप नज़रअंदाज ना करें, क्योंकि इसकी बड़ी सख्त जो है एडवर्स इम्पैक्ट होगा। मैं बड़ा मशहूर हूँ लाहौर चैम्बर का, यहाँ मैं बड़ा आता रहता था और मैं सोहेल शाहिर साहब से कह रहा था कि काफ़ी अरसे से मुझे दावत नहीं मिली है, लेकिन इसलिए मैं बड़ा खुश हूँ कि आज यहाँ आया हूँ, क्योंकि ये एक बड़ा प्रोग्रेसिव चैम्बर है। मुझे इत्तेफाक हुआ है पाकिस्तान के माशाल्लाह हर चैम्बर में जाने का, बात करने का, इंटरेक्शन करने का, लेकिन मैं आपको ये बता रहा हूँ कि जो भी मेरी इंटरेक्शन लाहौर चैम्बर की हुई है, इनकी थिंकिंग जो है वो दूसरे चैम्बर्स के मुकाबले में वो नहीं है कि अपने मुफाद के लिए हम क्या करें, लेकिन मुल्क के लिए क्या करें। और आप देखें कि ये जो आज का टॉपिक है ये भी एक ब्रॉड कैनवास टॉपिक है। इट इज़ नॉट जस्ट कन्फाइंड टू देयर ओन इंटरेस्ट कि बिजनेस क्या कर सकें। तो आई वॉन्ट टू थैंक नुमान साहब एंड ऑल अदर ऑफिस बेयरर्स फॉर गिविंग मी दिस अपॉर्चुनिटी। Now, because the topic is past, present and future, and there are some very younger people who have not seen what the past of the country was. We have been here lamenting about everything which is wrong, and this country is the master in finding the faults and having the diagnosis of our problems. But this is a country, ladies and gentlemen, which for first 40 years, from 1947 to 1989-90, was one of the fastest growing country in the world. Its rate of growth for 40 years was excess of 6%, while our neighbor India was growing at 3%, and Bangladesh was stagnating at that time. And we were quoted as the role model for most developing countries. And since then, we have become a laggard even in South Asia. For the last 30 years, our record has been that of dismal performance. And therefore, the question which I explored, and it is now documented in my research book called Governing the Ungovernable, is that at that time, most of our institutions of governance, whether it was the executive branch, whether it was the judiciary, whether it was the parliament, and there were interruptions to the parliament reform, and Rabbani Sahab has really pointed out what period we have gone through, so I won't repeat that, were very strong institutions. They consisted of competent people selected on merit and people of integrity. And they were dedicated to the uplift of Pakistan. At the time of the partition, Yabar Ali Saab ne bhi kaha aur Shahid Saab ne bhi kaha aur bade logon ne kaha, we didn't have any money even to pay to our civil servants. It was Adamjis and Habibs who actually wrote the checks for paying their salaries. The State Bank of Pakistan still today is showing our due share as receivables from Reserve Bank of India, which we never got it. We had to accommodate 8 million people of refugees, 25% of the population. We had to go through a war with India in 1965. We had to witness the breakup of Pakistan, with East Pakistan becoming Bangladesh. We had the war in Afghanistan in which Pakistan participated, and we had the nationalization of our industries, commerce, trade, education, banks in 1970s, and then was oil price crisis of the 1970s. Despite these shocks, Pakistan did extremely well. And this was because of the very strong institutions of governance, both on the three sides, which really helped us. And that, I think, is the lesson which we have to learn. That if you really want these policies, however beautiful these policies may be, and I can assure you, Mr. President, that I have compiled all the policies, the plans, the strategy papers, and they will fill this room. They are beautifully written papers, but they are not implemented. In 1960, the education policy by the minister at that time, Mr. Sharif, said that by 1970, we should have universal primary education. The 1970 policy said we will have it by 1980. And today, we are in 2022. We still do not have universal primary education. If there was a universal primary education, our indicators of human capital, which really lead to economic development, would have looked extremely favorable. And that is what the Bangladesh story is. That is that they invested in human capital and empowered their females to participate in the labor force. So that is where we have neglected over a period of time. Number one. Number two, we have got a confrontational and adversarial relationship between the state, the private sector, and the civil society. The successful countries have been those where they have worked together in nexus. Japan Inc., Korea Inc., China Inc., Malaysia Inc., and I can keep you, and now Bangladesh Inc., where they have their own roles defined, and they work in tandem, and they work in sync, and they work together, rather than complaining, यार प्राइवेट सेक्टर तो सारा चोर है, सारे रेंट सीकिंग है, गवर्नमेंट के लिए कहते हैं जी वो सारे बेईमान हैं, करप्ट हैं, सारा पैसा खा जाते हैं, सिविल सोसाइटी के लिए कहते हैं कि जी वो तो अपनी बेगमात जो हैं वो फारिग काम में जाके और ये करती हैं. We have this kind of disdainful attitude towards each other. Unless we work together, and there are roles for each. The state has to be powerful. The old story of minimization of the role of the state is no longer valid. And you look at the East Asian countries' experience, you need a strong state. But it has to provide you the law and order, the security of property and a person. It has to lay down the infrastructure. It has to invest in human capital. And it has to have macroeconomic stability so that the policies are transparent and known to the private sector. It has no business in running businesses. I have done a report on the SOEs. We are incurring a loss of 1 trillion rupees directly and indirectly because of these 85 SOEs. And I've prepared the implementation plan as to which one will be retained, which will be restructured, which will be privatized. But these have not been actually implemented, because what this happens is that your fiscal deficit will be reduced by 1 trillion, your borrowing will be reduced, and you don't have to have the kind of situation we are where 4 trillion rupees is spent on just interest payments. That is a low-hanging fruit. So the state has to keep away from interfering in the business. The private sector has a role to play, which is to be enterprising, to be innovative, and go into the areas where our domestic supply is inadequate, and that's why we have to go for imports. We need indigenous fuels for our energy. We have to develop our own oil and gas wells, which we have neglected for a long time. And we have to have petrochemical complex. We have to have steel mill of the modern scale. We have to have the refineries so that we can bring in the crudes. These are the investments. And I see the private sector going into real estate and making, quick money. Please do consider that the future of this country, if you want to reduce the gap between the domestic demand and the domestic supply, is lay down the heavy and the basic industries. I thought Mr. Bhutto had that in mind, but that never was materialized. So that is my plea to the private sector. Think big and in the future. The third thing is that, and the civil society has to play a role. Civil society is very good at working with the communities. I spent some time in a very remote areas of Gilgit-Baltistan, and I met the cooperatives of the farmers, and they were diversifying their own crops from subsistence crop to the cash crops. But they didn't have the facilities for agro-processing and marketing to Pakistan. Now there's a private sector can come into working with the communities. The communities also set up educational institutions, health facilities, which Bangladesh has also done. So civil society, private sector, and the state have to work together as a team to push this country forward. As far as Mr. Shahid Hamid has really pointed out, and several other people, that I greatly respect the work which Mr. Rabbani has done in 18th Amendment to devolve from the federal government to the provincial governments. And then 7th NFC has given the resources to the provinces, which are now almost 60%, and that's why Aisha is very much constrained as far as the federal government finances are concerned. But this devolution is incomplete. You have to take it down to the local governments. Three things will happen, and I don't want to repeat the arguments which Judge Saab had already made. First, that the cost of constructing your infrastructure would be lower than that is done by the PWD sitting in Karachi or Lahore or Peshawar. The kind of projects which will be identified and implemented will be responsive to the needs of the local population. And third, the propensity to pay taxes and fees increases whenever there is the visibility of that expenditure being incurred in the areas. People do spend the money. And this is experience all over the world. So we have to carry out the devolution to the local governments and empower the communities to decide what is the best for them. I am a civil servant, and I used to be very arrogant that I know what the problems are. Sitting in Karachi, I would approve 500 primary schools all over Sindh, not knowing whether they need the schools, whether there are teachers there, whether there will be enough students who will be coming in to occupy these schools. These are all over-centralized decisions. My last point is what I call in this country, there is a governance paradox. We have too much regulation where it is not needed, which is on industrialization. And Yawar Sahab has pointed out the number of NOCs and the number of clearances has been increasing. You are stymieing the industrialization, but there is too little regulation where it is needed. You get spurious drugs all over the place. You get all adulterated food. You get environmental hazards with sanitation not being taken care of and filth all over, in which you have water which is contaminated. That's where regulation is required. But there's no regulation at all in those areas. We have then too much accountability and too little accountability. We have this honest civil servants, as Kamran pointed out, who are scared to take decisions because they say nobody has been taken to account for acts of omission, but they have been taken to task for acts of commission. So it's better to pass on the buck to somebody or don't take a decision, because this will not really entitle me to any accountability, court or the media trial or anything. But at the same time, the corrupt officers in every government, in every department, are thriving. Nobody is actually catching them for what they are doing. So on the one hand, we have too much accountability, which is really retarding the pace of the decision making, and then we have too little accountability, where corrupt people in the government are making money right and left with impunity. Then we have too much taxation on the formal sector of the economy. You have super taxes, and Mr. Shabbar Zaidi will be the right person. And you have people and the sectors outside the economy which are completely untouched. I did a paper on the provincial taxes. Agriculture, services, and property tax. All three can generate between 2.6 to 3% of GDP. What they are doing is 1%, which is less than what they were getting before the 7th National Finance Commission, because they are not making any efforts in order to tax this. You are being asked as the formal sector to pay super taxes. But what about the people who are doing the same business in your line, and they are not paying GST, they are not paying any income tax, nobody is going after them. And that, I think, is too much taxation, and there is too little taxation at the same time. Then we have too much of judicial activism and too little of judicial dispensation. FBR, last time I saw that, had trillions of rupees, I think 2.6 or 3.6 trillion of rupees of overdue taxes under stay orders from the courts. 2.6 to 3%. And when I was at the State Bank, I had almost trillion of rupees at that time in defaulted loans which were stayed. And you get stay orders for umpteen years, and I don't know why the superior judiciary can decide that after 6 months you would vacate the stay order and carry on with the real proceedings. And therefore your resources are stuck because of these judicial processes. And finally, I would say that we have got to go and try to have a system of what I call as positive mindset and thinking. I have worked on 50 countries in the world when I have been in the World Bank. I have never seen a country which says, oh, everything is going to collapse, because then you give up. You don't make your best effort. The countries have faced crisis, worse than Pakistan. But they say, despite these difficulties, despite these crises, we can do it. And we would prove to the rest of the world that we have this resilience to come out of these crises. But हमारे यहाँ क्या होता है, हर आदमी जो है वो cynic हो गया है, negative thinking है, एक दूसरे को blame करते हैं. आयशा ने बड़ी अच्छी बातें की कि society जो है polarize हुई है. अपने ख़ानदान में हम बैठ के एक दूसरे से बात नहीं कर सकते क्योंकि वो एक दूसरे से नाराज़ हो जाते हैं. इस तरह से मुल्क की तरक्की नहीं हो सकती. तो future जो है, that is not on economic policies, that is not on governance, but that is on changing your mindset to a positive attitude, to a constructive attitude, to do it kind of attitude. And that's my message to the younger people who are sitting here, because our generation has failed. Thank you very much for organizing this.